I'd like to begin with a couple announcements. You know that you have an exam on May 1st, so you have an exam coming up. And you also know that you have a paper due in class on May 20th, so you may want to keep an eye on those and check in with Lisa, especially if you need any help with the paper or getting started on that. Also, I know in the reader that there are some figures missing. If you want to send an email to Lisa about the missing figures, we will post those on the course website at our earliest convenience. Some have been posted, but I understand that others are still missing, and we will take care of those. Also, the slides for this lecture were posted as PDFs, but they will also be posted as PowerPoints, as will also be the case with Friday's lecture. In the past, people have said, please don't post PowerPoints because I don't have PowerPoints. So most everybody has PDFs, so I did that. But now we'll do both. So that's it. Today we're going to talk about individuals in intimate relationships. And we come to this point in the course because we have, in previous lectures, talked about some basic dimensions that are evident in all close relationships, which is to say that the participants in those relationships have a biological sex, being male or female, or both within a relationship, and they have an orientation toward being in a relationship that is being in a relationship with another individual who has the same sex as they do or the other sex. And so those are sort of basic parameters of what happens in a relationship, and we, as you saw, we really cannot ignore those key elements of relationships. And as at that point, we left that lecture, and I alluded to the idea that within the categories of men and women, regardless of whether they are gay or straight, within those basic categories, we also have to think about individual differences. We have to think about the individuals in the categories. Now we're going to really focus on that today. But the transition from the gender and orientation lecture to the attraction lecture was that we want to think about how these people get connected up. We spent a lot of time talking about that, who gets attracted to whom, and how do those processes unfold? How do we pick partners and mates? And at the end of our previous lecture, I mentioned that as best we can tell, one of the key conditions for a relationship to move forward is that partners have the feeling that they can create a conversational platform, a shared platform for understanding one another, for talking to one another, and that they have a really strong positive affective reaction to those conversations. And I mentioned that two people who meet who then seem to think that they like one another don't just talk more, they don't have more volume of speech, but they do have more interactional turn-taking, right? There's more turns that are taken. There's a higher rate of back and forth conversation, and we have to assume higher levels of positive emotion. People connect with one another, and they share a certain amount of excitement with one another, and that seems to be one important precondition to the relationship moving forward. So what is it that people eventually come to share? What is it that people eventually come to know about one another as their relationship deepens? Today we're going to answer that question. We're going to talk about what are the characteristics of individuals that people who study relationships have gotten excited about. How do we think about the variety of human individuals in general, but more particularly, how do we think about that in a way that foreshadows where a relationship is going to go? How do we think about all of the infinite variety of humanity in a way that allows us to systematize it? And then how can we take that system and link it up to the development and course of relationships? Okay, so that's what I want to try to accomplish today. And I will do so in really 4 different ways. First, I'm going to talk about how we think about individuals and how that then tells us about their relationships. And here I'm going to focus on 2 things. One are personality traits, the individual traits that people have, And then I'm going to contrast that approach with a personality dynamics model, dynamics of personality. And there's going to be some familiar concepts that you'll hear at this point. But separate from personality, I'm going to talk about early experiences that we have within relationships that then affect who we are as individuals. Okay? So in the first case, I'm going to be talking about two perspectives that help us to say, how do we differentiate among people? And once we've done that, what are the implications of those differentiations for the relationships that then ensue? And I'll contrast that in the second part with how does our personality develop within the context of our families, of our caregiving relationships that we have when we're young, and how does that then influence who we are as individuals and therefore in relationships. I think that volume is just a little bit high. I'm going to turn that down. So personality traits, I want to start there with a guy named Lewis Terman. In the late 1930s, he's a professor at Stanford. He's very well known for doing a longitudinal study of really, really, really smart people. It's called the termite study. And these are the study of genius. That's what Terman did, and he was the one who really brought intelligence testing from Germany to the United States, turns out. But he also studied genius of another kind, and that is, what are the characteristics that people have to have in order to be good mates? So the very earliest thinking about what makes a relationship thrive or falter was that some people are good at it and some people aren't by virtue of their personality. Okay? So 1938, here's what Terman said. A large proportion of incompatible marriages are so because of a predisposition to unhappiness in one or both of the spouses. Whether by nature or by nurture, there are persons so lacking in the qualities which make for compatibility that they would be incapable of finding happiness in any marriage. Wow. I don't know what his marriage was like, but it sounds like he's complaining a little bit there. I don't know. I actually don't know what his marriage was like. A classic study was conducted around this same time with this same perspective that really why your relationship is going to thrive or falter is because of your personality, who you are as an individual. There's some truth to this perspective. Kelly and Conley, in 1987, published a paper that actually began in the 1930s. And what they did is they got 300 couples who were engaged. 278 of them eventually got married. And then they followed them up 30 years later and then 30 years or so after that. So this is basically a 5-decade-long study to examine how personality characteristics affect the development of our relationships. Or maybe I should say the outcome of our relationships. So what's interesting about this study is that Kelly, it was Lowell Kelly who did this study, he asked not the individuals themselves to report on their personalities, and not even their partners to report on their personalities, but people who knew them, their acquaintances. And 5 people made these judgments. So if you were in this study, 5 of your acquaintances, people who knew you, would rate your personality, and then they would form an aggregate index of your personality around a few key dimensions that people thought were important: neuroticism, extroversion, impulse control, and agreeableness. Okay? They're pretty much what you think. Neuroticism is negative emotionality, negative affectivity, a propensity to experience and express negative emotion. People vary in their propensity to be positive, in their propensity to be negative. Neuroticism, negative affectivity, is a propensity to experience and express a lot of negative emotion. Okay? And then you can see a couple of other dimensions: extroversion, how outgoing you are; impulse control, how sort of mindful you are before you make decisions versus impulsive, you just jump into situations and possibly make bad decisions. And agreeableness is sort of an interpersonal pleasantness. Okay, so these 5 acquaintances for each one of these spouses, 278 couples, were making judgments on these dimensions. And then as time passed, people would report on how their relationships were going at these different times. And 50 of the couples ended in divorce. 110 of them were not terribly bad and were probably better than average. And 17 of them were pretty bad. That's kind of a small number. I would not do the study in this exact way because it sort of underrepresents some misery there. I probably would have taken the divorced ones out and then split the rest in half or something. But anyway, we'll get a flavor of different kinds of couples over 5 decades. And we'll see if Terman was right. So on the upper left here, we have the results from the women's personality in relation to the 3 marital outcomes that I just outlined. Okay? So you can see up there for women, and then on the bottom right-hand corner, the men, the 110 happy people, the 17 chronically unhappy people, unhappy for 50 years, right? And then divorced people, the 50 couples that got divorced. And you can see pretty clearly with these white bars, that's negative affectivity. Okay, that's what we call neuroticism, negative affectivity. And you can see that the people who ended up being happy, whether they were men or women, had relatively low levels of negative affectivity. And then for people who got divorced, they had relatively high levels of negative affectivity. You see that? But there's an interesting difference between men and women, huh? So you see that among the men, the unhappy and divorced men were about the same in their levels of negative affectivity, whereas here there is more of a linear progression from the happy to the unhappy to the divorced folks. So in order for men to be unhappy, it seemed like they would have to have higher levels of negative affectivity. Now, impulsivity didn't matter at all for women, but it mattered a lot for men. So if you have high levels of impulse control, so that you sort of think through your decisions, maybe you check in with other people, you don't just sort of go off half-cocked and do whatever you want to do, you are more likely to be happy. And if you are low in impulse control, if you can't sort of choose to not drink alcohol or do things that are bad for you, then you end up, to the extent that your impulsivity is higher, the likelihood of your being divorced, to the extent that your impulse control is lower, the likelihood that you end up divorced is greater. Okay? Now, why might it have been, circa 1930 and 40, why might it have been that impulse control mattered more for men than for women? Any guesses about that? Women generally weren't in the workforce in the 1940s, right? So these are probably men who are not only creating difficulties within their relationships, but creating difficulties within the workforce for themselves, right? So it's not as though they turn off their impulse control when they get to work. It's the same problem. Women not outside the home quite as much, 1940s. Probably not as big, probably did not bring a lot of problems into the home in the same way a man would. I suspect the same issue holds for negative affectivity. So, pretty clear that over the span of 5 decades, high levels of negative emotionality would be detrimental for your relationship. And here's a cartoon from the New Yorker. You're both miserable wretches, that's what the therapist is saying, but I suppose that's beside the point. It's not beside the point. It's the whole point, right? Social learning theory, you remember, said that relationships succeed and fail because of the rewards and costs that we exchange in our conversations. They reject the idea that negative affectivity would matter because they say what really matters is the exchange of positive and negative behaviors. That's an incomplete view. We can now see that that's an incomplete view. In fact, I have done research with some colleagues showing that negative affectivity pushes down your levels of relationship quality. It doesn't increase the rate at which you deteriorate, but when you start a relationship and throughout the course of your relationship, you have lower levels of satisfaction compared to someone who's high in negative who's low in negative affectivity. Okay? So that is not beside the point. Psychologists since that time have gotten really interested in figuring out what are the core dimensions of human personality. And if you've taken a course in social psychology or personality psychology, you know there is a psychometric tradition by which people make judgments about themselves. Then those judgments are crunched down and used to generate 5 factors of personality. if you adopt a trait-based view of personality, people now say that there are 5 dimensions to your personality. Here they are: extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, which I mentioned, and openness. 3 of these are consistently related to relationship quality: agreeableness, neuroticism, and openness, in just the way you would expect. I've already talked about neuroticism. People who are agreeable, who are generally more agreeable, and who would be rated by others as more agreeable, have better relationships, slightly. They're nicer to talk to. People who are more open also have a little more energy and bring that to their relationship. So we now know that those 3 aspects of what are called the big 5 personality traits do help us to understand personality. If you want to take this questionnaire, you can go to that website right there. It's called outofservice.com. There's a whole bunch of questionnaire measures there from psychology. And if you go on the link that says Big 5, you'll be able to take the big one of the standard Big 5 personality measures. And you will see where you fit on these dimensions. Or even better, have your partner do it, huh? Or a prospective partner. Okay, so neuroticism matters. Negative emotionality matters, and it matters a lot. But we have to ask the question, why? A person named Sandra Murray has created something called the dependency regulation model, which you'll be reading about in the individual chapter. The dependency regulation model doesn't start with neuroticism. It starts with self-esteem, which is usually linked to neuroticism. It's a relatively stable personality trait, low self-esteem is, and we measure it with things like, items like, I'm inclined to feel that I'm a failure, I feel I do not have much to be proud of, I wish I could have more respect for myself. And you can see that this is my orientation toward myself. I either value or do not value myself. And this, according to the dependency regulation model, has a really, really important characteristic. The really important characteristic is that among individuals who have really low self-esteem, they tend to assume that other people believe the exact same thing as they do. Okay? So I'm a low self-esteem person, and I'm looking in the mirror and I'm looking at myself, and I don't feel very good about myself, right? I'm saying things like, I'm a failure, right? I am not a good person. I don't feel good about who I am as an individual. The unfortunate subsequent step in this chain is that whenever somebody else looks at them, their partner, their intimate partner, they assume that their partner has the exact same reaction, and it's not true. Okay? So they have a negative bias in how others perceive them. Right? They assume that others perceive them in the same way, the same biased, negative way that they perceive themselves. Okay? This, as you might imagine, is kind of costly. And here's how that goes. According to the dependency regulation model, there's a pretty good amount of support for this. So, low self-esteem, I have poor self-regard. That's how we would define that. You assume that other people agree with you, and you then approach your relationship saying, why don't you care more for me? Right? You start with the assumption that you believe the same thing about me that I believe about me, and so I say, what are you doing in this relationship with me? Why don't you love me more? Why can't you support me more? Why aren't you more in love with me? Right? Now, and that's the expression of the discontent. You can imagine it's hard to be in a relationship with that person. The partner is saying, "What? I don't understand. I care for you. Everything that I've said indicates that I care about you. I love you. I think you're great. I really want to be in this relationship with you. But stop asking me to tell you how much I love you all the time. That's starting to get annoying, right? Me having to reassure you, constantly reassure you that you're a good person and I love you. Now, now that I think about it, maybe I don't love you so much. This is getting taxing. This is starting to be costly. I'm constantly having to prop you up, okay? And the relationship then falters. Okay? So there's this funny thing that happens among individuals who have low self-esteem. They say, you must not like me to the same extent that I don't like me. And we know that that's not true. we know that the correlation between my perceptions of myself and how much I think I'm a good person and our partner's perceptions of us are not that closely related. So we know it's an erroneous reading of the social situation, and that sort of sets the, there's a reason why this graph goes downhill. Yes, question? What types of items would there be on a neuroticism scale? It's a great question. Let's see, I haven't looked at one of these. I tend to be anxious. I tend to be kind of pessimistic. When people say, when people make comments about me, I tend to think about it for a long time. Right? So there's sort of I like to think of negative emotionality as like a radiator. On the East Coast, they have radiators in houses which generate heat, and they sort of push out more and more heat when they're turned on. People who are higher in negative affectivity sort of radiate that sort of pessimism and that brooding. And it's not that they're unpleasant people to be with, but there is that sort of a negative tinge to the way that they view the world. Okay? So it's got anxiety in there, it's got a pessimism, it's got a sort of a reactivity and a heightened social sensitivity. Yes, question? Good question. To a significant degree, it's heritable. It's a genetic, the evidence indicates that it's a genetic phenomenon. So not entirely, right? So there's the rub, is that you have to part of what's important to do in a relationship is to take the capacities that you have and use them to reach out and try to understand your partner. Most of us do that naturally. We do that we recognize that that's part of the deal in a relationship. I've got some baggage, and my partner needs to respond to that, and my partner has baggage, and I need to respond to that. And part of what you have to do when you're in a relationship with an individual who tends to be a little more neurotic is just say, that's just the deal that they were handed in life. That is probably, it's not purely genetic. There's probably maybe a third or even more of the variability in negative affectivity in the population is environmental. And certainly if you're in a relationship with an individual who's high in negative affectivity and who has a really crappy job where they're exposed to bosses who are telling them how bad they are, wow, that's a hard partner to hang around with, right? As opposed to a person who's high in negative affectivity who's living on a trust fund, right? On a boat somewhere in the Atlantic. I mean, that's a good partner. Right, the exact same level of negative emotionality sort of gets cranked up depending on the environment. So short answer is a big part of it is genetic. Question? Those two go together pretty closely. One might be in your head, sort of like, it's always sort of banging around in your head. Is why do people in general think so little of me? And then the expression of that within your relationship. There is some evidence by John Holmes, published recently in Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. It says that if you can take a person who's low in self-esteem and have them actually listen to the compliments that their partner pays to them, and get them to remind them of that without sort of undercutting it. Like, oh, they're just saying that to be nice, right? No, you say, no, they really mean it. It's sincere, it's genuine, and to really sort of reinforce that message within the context of their relationships, that this can offset a lot of the effects of negative affectivity, which in effect is saying, instead of having costs associated with me telling you that you're a good person, me having to, asking me for reassurance all the time, if that can be generated internally, and really people can start to recognize that this is sort of a trick that their mind is playing on them, that can offset a lot of these effects, right? But it does require a certain amount of generative capacity on that individual's part, which is a bit like swimming upstream. It's a little bit hard, yeah.
I wonder, if people dislike themselves for specific reasons, why would they question why other people don't like them? Wouldn't they assume, well, I don't like myself because of X, he must not like me because of that too? I wonder why they say, why don't you care?
Yeah, why don't they assume that other people are sort of neutral or positive in their relation? Like, if I have an explanation for why I'm an unlovable person, that doesn't necessarily follow that another person has that same explanation, right? So why would that be a shared perspective? I think that's a lot more rational than the process actually unfolds. I don't think people necessarily say, oh, I have this genetic predisposition, and my brother hates me, and my parents argue a lot, and they got divorced, and now my mom is living with this other guy who hates me. Therefore, I have reasons to believe that I'm unlovable because my mother was telling me that all the time. But you, honey, you should see me in an unbiased and loving way. I don't think it has that rational component to it. But through therapy, you could say, oh, let's figure this out. A lot of what good therapy is about is saying, other people don't see you that way. And they say, no, they really do. No, other people really don't. And you help to see a person say, well, that's your stuff. That's not, you're sort of throwing that onto somebody else, and that's not fair. In fact, you'll learn in the treatment chapter that we call that object relations therapy. You start to say, oh, I get it. The way that I perceive myself is not the same as the way other people perceive me, and I have to give them a chance to tell me how they perceive me. And once I do that, that can sort of clear up that sort of misunderstanding that I have about my partner's perceptions. But the point is, it takes some work. It's a bias. You sort of go into the game with one foot behind you. Okay. Here is a cartoon from Canterville that shows this phenomenon. Here's Lamont, I think is his name, Lamont, says, Susan's going to tell me the story I wrote is bad. Susan's going to tell me the story I wrote is awful. Lamont, I have to tell you, this might be just the best story I've ever read. And he says, he thinks, it's worse than I thought. She's trying to spare my feelings, right? So even the most positive statement sort of gets discounted. And you can imagine how difficult this relationship would be for her, right? So the phenomenon, to a significant degree, exists within the partner. And this partner says, well, how can I share my positive feelings for you if you constantly shoot it down, right? Why do I have to do all this work? And it becomes very difficult on that partner's, from that partner's perspective to sort of keep puffing up your partner's esteem. So that is the dependency regulation model. And I think in the textbook we call that making mountains out of molehills, right? So it's good to check our perceptions of that our partners have. That's, by the way, one of the reasons why communication matters in relationships. Communication matters in relationships because we cannot necessarily assume that two people see the exact same thing the exact same way. People who communicate say, are you seeing this the same way I am? We just need to talk about that. And you'll get into that pretty intently when you talk about cognitive processes in relationships. Well, that's one way of thinking about how individuals vary and the ways in which those individual differences feed forward to affect the quality of your relationship. Okay, question here, yes? The more you endorse, the worse it is. So, but there is in contemporary Western society a certain amount of negative affectivity that we all have. In fact, I give a 20-item version of this questionnaire, probably not unlike the one you'll see if you go to that website I indicated. And the average number of symptoms endorsed, not symptoms, but the average number of items endorsed is like 5 or 6 for men. Women tend to be a little higher. They're more like 9 or 10. So it's not like, we all start from 0 and anything after 0 gets you into trouble. We all start from, it's kind of good to be a little crazy, right? It's kind of good to be to worry a little bit about some things. Like if your boss criticizes you, well, maybe you should take that seriously, right? There's sort of a normative basis for some neuroses. So it's not that you have to have a clean slate and that if you don't have a clean slate, you get into trouble. So I should have clarified that. Okay. So personality dynamics. There's another group of psychologists that say personality traits are hogwash. That's crazy. That's total bullshit. It's got nothing to do with how human beings work, and it's just you guys getting people to fill out questionnaires and run data analyses. What really matters are not traits, but personality dynamics. Traits are like nouns. It's just a descriptor. But give me a verb. Give me something that motivates you. Give me something that tells me why you want to do something, right? So motives that drive our behavior. Traits can be understood largely without any reference to context, right? So sometimes it's good to be neurotic. Sometimes it's not good to be agreeable, right? There are times when it's not good to be agreeable. There's times when you might not even want to be all that conscientious, right? So we don't understand the traits in relation to any kind of context. We need a context. And when we assess dynamics, we can get at those contexts in a little more of a rich manner. But there's a problem. I can pretty much fill out a questionnaire about my own personality. You can do it as well. Your partners can do it. People can do it. I could do it for you if I got to know you well enough. But it's really hard to know what your dynamics are. Like, what is it that motivates you? I remember I was doing couples therapy with one guy, and I was with one couple, and the guy was, I asked him to fill out an empathy measure. And he was the least empathic guy in the world I had ever met up to that point in my life. And he's filling out this questionnaire, and he's saying, oh, I always do that. I'm the most, I listen to everybody, their point of view. So we don't always read ourselves the right way, right? And I read this guy's questionnaire. I was like, oh, my God. He has no insight whatsoever to what is driving his behavior. Not uncommon for people who are really struggling in their relationships. And so this creates a problem. How do you measure personality dynamics, right? Now, what I'm about to tell you, drives the psychometric trait people crazy, absolutely crazy. So these two groups kind of fight with one another, which makes it interesting. And they say, here's what you have to do. It's a little bit like the Rorschach, if any of you have taken the Rorschach. You know, the ink blot test, which you probably learned about in abnormal psychology, right? Here's a blot, tell me what this might be, and show me where that is in the blot, right? This is called the thematic apperception test. And it is it's a kind of a projective test, just like the Rorschach. But here now there's pictures, right? Pictures that we all recognize. They're not just ink blots, but they're real pictures. And up in the upper left, you see someone, there's 12 cards, I believe. Lisa, have you ever given a TAT? Lisa's done this? So aren't there 12 cards? Yeah, and the instructor chooses, the administrator chooses how many and which ones. So the TAT, the thematic apperception test. Apperception, one of those old funky words that we no longer use. Kind of like neuroticism, maybe. So the person up in the left shows an individual these images and says, tell me a story. I'd like you to take a few minutes to tell me a story about each of the pictures I'm about to show you. There's about 10 pictures I'm going to show you. And I'd like that story to have a beginning and a middle and an end. Okay, and the person then tells a story, and the administrator writes down exactly what the person has said. And then later, they code those responses for the extent to which they display power and agency, and intimacy and communication. Intimacy and communion, sorry. Okay? And power and agency we define as concern about having an impact, a control, or influence on another person, or a group, or the world at large. Like power. Sometimes when people tell stories, there's power. There's somebody influencing somebody else, somebody hurting somebody else, somebody telling somebody else what to do. But sometimes there's intimacy and communion. There's connection, there's bonding, there's joining, right? And what's interesting is the same picture can elicit different sorts of responses, obviously. Now, if I were to ask these questions of you, to say, tell me a story about this image right here. And here's an image. There's a guy right there. I don't know if you can see him. There's a woman here with her hand on her face, holding the doorknob. And she might be saying, that was the best night of sex I've had in my life. Oh my goodness, that was great. Communion, connection. And he's like just recovering, right? Or she could say, the person could be telling the story saying, Why did I just kill that man? Right? I've heard people tell these stories. Why did I just kill that man? I was upset at him. He said some things that I didn't like. It got out of hand. I happened to have a weapon, and I killed him. First one, intimacy and communion. Second one, power and agency, right? So you would give these stories, and you can see how this would drive a psychometrically oriented person crazy, to say, oh, the stories reveal so much about you. Well, maybe they do, maybe they don't. That becomes what we would say is an empirical question. It remains to be demonstrated with real data. So then you look at all of these responses across all 10 or 12 pictures that you've shown, and then you look at those responses in relation So here's what we find when people do this. Most of this is cross-sectional. So most of this is all of the data were collected at one point in time. So we can't be too confident that there's a causal effect here, but we can't rule it out either. Some of this is longitudinal. So people who show a lot of need for power, like they're always talking about hierarchical relationships and influence and one person having more resources than another person, they tend to be less satisfied in their dating relationships. They tend to be more likely to end their dating relationships. They have more dating relationships as a result, and they tend to report engaging in more physical abuse within their relationships. People who are high in need for intimacy report more positive emotion in their relationships. They report more satisfying relationships. They also say that their relationships at work are better. And this should sound familiar to you. What's that sound like to you? Say what? Sounds like gender, doesn't it? Sounds like masculinity and femininity. So part of what's interesting about this perspective is that it might be, in a sense, an independent corroboration of sex roles and the importance of sex roles. But some of the need for power is a little bit exploitative, right? Remember that when I talked about gender in the sex, gender, and orientation lecture, I talked about how higher levels of both of these, at least assessed traditionally through something called the BEM sex role inventory, which appears in the gender chapter. When people have high levels of masculinity and it's combined with high levels of femininity, that tends to be a pretty effective individual. This allows for the possibility that sometimes that gets to such a high point that it becomes destructive. Okay? But there is a lot of similarity between the two perspectives. Yes, question?
Is agency and power, are they synonymous?
Agency and power, I don't think they differentiate between them so much in this perspective. You know, agency means a believed capacity that you can do things. Power has a very murky history in the social sciences, but it generally means that somebody has control over the outcomes that affect them. Power is one of those things that we all know is important, but it's really hard to measure. So anyway, that's the personality dynamics model. And those are the two perspectives that help us to understand variability amongst individuals, that have been used at least, to understand how variability among individuals can be used to help us to predict characteristics of our relationship functioning, right? So in both cases, I outlined dimensions of individual personality assessed through different means, one through personality questionnaire traits, the other one through this semi-projective method called the TAT. And it helps us to understand characteristics of relationships that are likely to be good or bad. They're a little different, but there's some messages here that sound familiar, and I don't think there's anything terribly shocking, though the salience of negative emotionality is very powerful, and it shows up in countless times in countless studies. So, now we come to the second part of how to think about individuals and relationships, and here I'm going to be talking about intergenerational transmission effects. That is to say, characteristics of who we are emotionally, cognitively, interpersonally that get linked back to the families that we grew up in. Okay? We're talking about intergenerational transmission. Something gets transmitted across generations. And we're going to talk about this in a broad sense, first talking about families and things that happen within families, but then focusing specifically on the caregiver relationship within those families. Okay, so our first pass at this is going to be a little more coarse, but then we're going to hone in. We're going to focus in on the actual transactions between you, say, and the person or people who raised you. So how do individuals vary? Well, sure, traits and motives matter, but we find deep roots in our interpersonal histories, the families that we grew up in, and what we call our attachment histories, or those caregiver relationships. And we know the reason people think about families is not hard to understand, is that we grow up in families. We are reared and socialized within families. And families provide for the well-being of their members, right? They provide nutrition, they provide comfort and security, and an environment in which to be raised in a healthy and safe and protected way. Economically, so that we have resources to purchase the things we need. And so families matter. They do a lot for people. And so we ask the question, how it seems inevitable that the nature of our family relationship would feed forward to affect our relationships. How is that the case? And how does that happen? And as I said, we'll be talking about this from the family of origin perspective and the attachment perspective. And we can ask the question, what happens when the family breaks down? And we can ask what the lasting effects are that families have, and what exactly gets transmitted. So here are the three key transmission questions. By the way, all the pictures from today's lecture are from a Belgian sculptor named Jean Fallon, who passed away about 2 years ago. And I love this picture. It's somebody's head, but it looks like a luggage. It looks like a suitcase. If that's not a depiction of the baggage that we all bring into our relationships, I don't know what is. So what are our three transmission questions? What are the questions that I want to use to orient us, at least in this first part? First, we want to know what's the association between G1, that is generation 1, that is our parents, G1 relationships, and G2 well-being in childhood. Okay? What is the effect of our parents' relationship on how we develop as children? Okay? This is a huge, huge literature, and I'm only going to scratch the surface of it, but I am going to hit the highlights. And then we can ask, what's the association between our parents' relationships and the relationships that you will now form at this stage and subsequent stages of your life? Okay? And then, well, we're going to ask the question, but is there an association? And to the extent that there is, what's that built upon? What is exactly transmitted? If it is the case that the relationships that you have and are about to have in the next 10 or 20 years of your lives are built in some small way on your parents' relationship, how does that happen? What is it that gets transmitted? Okay? So those are the three questions I want us to contemplate here. This is a popular topic. You can see there a cover of Time magazine, what divorce does to kids. And in the bottom there, I don't know if you can see it, it says, new research says the long-term damage is worse than you thought. Should unhappy parents stay hitched? Well, that's the big question, huh? This person up here on the top, Judith Wallerstein, says yes. Yes, unhappy people should get hitched because divorce is horrendous. The title of her book, The Unexpected Legacy of Divorce, a 25-year landmark study. This woman, Mavis Hetherington, by the way, Judith Wallerstein is a practitioner up in the Bay Area. And I think she's still an active practitioner. Lovely, lovely person. Mavis Hetherington, equally lovely person, retired professor at the University of Virginia. She says, no, wait, not so fast. You do not have the data in that book to support that conclusion, and I think it's a little more complicated than that. So there's big debate in the field over the effects of divorce on kids and whether parents should get divorced, and it has really important implications for what unhappy people should do, right? So, Judith Wallerstein says, the glass is really half empty. Divorce is terrible for children. Parents should do everything humanly possible to stay together. She says, for example, that when people do get divorced, when families end, the level of poverty increases. And I think in this class I've mentioned that the best predictor of poverty in this country is not race, it's not education. At least on a short-term basis, it's whether or not your parents have divorced. Because now the resources that existed within your family that were going to support one home now support two homes. And housing is expensive, right? So that is going to just suck out a lot of your money. And so somebody's going to have to pay a price for that, right? So Judith Wallerstein says, so all of a sudden you're trying to raise a child, not only in two different places, but with less resources to do so. Okay? Divorce creates emotional difficulties in parents and children. Divorce leads to short-tempered and coercive parenting. And of course, it's really usually a single-parent situation now. One of the benefits of being in a dual-partnered relationship is that if it just creates a lot of flexibilities for you. That if you're stressed out or have other responsibilities, that someone else can jump in and handle the situation with your children. Or if you're frustrated with your child, you have somebody who can come in and say, you know, I understand, let me take over. I'll take over now. I see you're getting frustrated. So you've got sort of a tag team approach to parenting, which is not quite as available to you usually if you're in a single parent family, right? That makes it hard. It just makes it hard. And this is what Judith Wallerstein has observed in mostly interview-based assessments of individuals who she studied. And she says, and the evidence tends to support the view that divorce doubles the risk of adverse outcomes among children. Okay? Which is to say that if we have two groups of children, one of whom's parents divorced, the other whom parents remained intact, the children whose parents have divorced have twice as much a likelihood of having some sort of emotional or educational or interpersonal difficulty than the children whose parents remained intact. So there's a doubling of the risk, right? That sounds huge. That sounds horrendous. It sounds terrible. But it's important to remember what gets doubled. If you have $1 in your pocket, and I say, I will double the money you have, I've only given you another $1, right? That's not a lot of money. So that's sort of the trick that we have to pay attention to. So Mavis Hetherington did a long-term study, studied people who were in intact marriages as well as those who whose parents ended their relationships in divorce, which wasn't the case in the Wallerstein study. This is pretty well pointed out in a special focus box in the reader. And she says, well, yeah, there is a doubling. You're absolutely 100% correct. But the doubling goes from about 15%, which is to say about 15% of the kids, broadly speaking, of the parents who are in intact marriages are going to have some problems. And the doubling goes to about 30% when you are talking about the kids of parents who divorce. That's a lot. That's a lot. We shouldn't dismiss that. But we also, and Mavis Hetherington is quick to point out, we also shouldn't ignore the fact that 70% of the kids whose parents divorce do just fine. Okay? So is the glass half empty or is the glass half full? It depends on your point of view. It really depends on your point of view. This doubling is a real phenomenon, but the doubling goes from 15% to 30%, leaving the vast majority of children, even those whose parents get divorced, as ending up pretty okay and pretty much undistinguishable from the people whose parents didn't divorce. Yeah?
Earlier mentioned people that are neurotic to get divorced more, so couldn't that also be the fact that, you know, that 15 to 30% have neurotic parents and aren't faring well because they wouldn't be good parents regardless?
Right. Sometimes divorce is not always bad. Though there is a certain level of, it gets a little tricky, because the neuroticism might be more damaging for the marital relationship than it is for the parenting relationship, possibly. We do know that that divorce is not always a bad thing, right? So, for example, if there is one parent who's really neurotic or really abusing drugs or abusing kids or engaging in high levels of conflict with the parent, well, that's not going to be advantageous for the child, right? So, are children scarred? 20 years later, they feel they are. They feel that the divorce had a long-term effect on them, but it's not so obvious. Like sometimes what happens is that if you were to grow up with divorced parents and then you start to have some problems with a relationship partner when you're 25 years old, you say, oh, it must be because my parents had trouble in their relationships. Well, sometimes relationships are just hard. Right? Sometimes relationships are just hard. Here's my equivalent explanation for that. If you've ever had the virtues of having a housekeeper, I have not. If you've ever had the virtues of having a housekeeper and all of a sudden something's missing, you say, oh, the housekeeper moved it. It just happens to be a convenient explanation that may have nothing to do with the truth, but it's a convenient, obvious explanation, right? I think something similar is going on with the kids who divorced. There's a question here, yeah.
Is that assuming that both parents are still in the child's life, although they are separated? So it's not including like absent father situations, stuff like that?
There's all kinds of divorces. What we're learning and what point number 3 here in Mavis. By the way, this book, if you are a child of divorce, you should read either of these 2 books. I would especially recommend reading Mavis Hetherington's book. But she says it depends on the divorce. There's a wide variety. There's all kinds of different ways. And in fact, divorce is not an event. It's a process that unfolds over years and years. And sometimes it's rough and sometimes it's not. But divorce is not a singular event. It's not a one-time event. It's a sort of a set of circumstances and events that transpire in an individual's life. And as a result, it means that they can go in lots of different directions. Another question. Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, how do they know that the negative consequences are a result of the divorce and what happens after that, or maybe like a prolonged exposure to a toxic environment or something like that?
It gets worse when there's a prolonged exposure to a toxic environment. So you can measure the extent to which, within a group of divorced people, you can measure the extent to which the parents set aside their differences and really sort of come together and help to raise the child in a healthy and productive way, which many people can do. Or you can, and they can report on that, and you can observe that, you can see that in people's conversations. Or the opposite, where people are bickering and fighting and constantly on each other's case in all kinds of different ways. Those kids don't do so well. And here's an important message. Let me jump ahead a little bit. You can see the other ideas here, but let me jump ahead, which is that the issue is not the divorce. Your point, the point about this heterogeneity within the experience of divorce raises the point that the issue isn't the divorce. The issue is the conflict associated with the divorce. Okay? Divorce can be good or bad, right? It's hard. It's almost always hard. But it can be good or bad, right? And we know that what contributes to the difficulties that parents and their children experience is usually the high levels of negative emotion associated with that, usually. Okay? So, is divorce just bad? End of story? Just don't get divorced? Well, no. Divorce is bad, but if you look at the kids prior to the divorce, before the divorce ever happened, you already see the same problems. Okay? So Andrew Cherlin did a study, had some data from British kids, 11,500 British kids that were all born in this 1 month in all over Britain. And they assessed them really intensively. And they followed them every year. I guess they followed them at birth, age 7 and age 11. And between ages 7 and 11, 192 people got divorced within this particular study. Okay? And then they said, okay, if we look after the divorce, we actually see the problems that you'd expect. They don't do as well in school. They're having emotional difficulties at a higher level. There's this doubling that I've been telling you about. If you go back prior to the divorce, these kids are already having some problems. It's not just the divorce. It's the quality of the relationship between the parents. The divorce is just a manifestation of a lot of conflict sometimes. Okay? So here's this conclusion. This is a very important study in my field. Andrew Cherlin and colleagues said, at least as much attention needs to be paid to the processes that occur in troubled, intact families as to the trauma that children suffer after their parents separate. Okay? So the negative, what children don't respond to whether or not there's a divorce. Children respond to, gee, this environment feels pretty threatening to me, right? And they usually take it one step further and they say, it's probably my fault somehow. Okay, that's really detrimental to kids. There are people who are in intact marriages filled with conflict that are certainly as bad as any divorce, right? So it's not the divorce per se. Divorce is a manifestation of a troubled relationship. And that troubled relationship can, to the extent that there are high levels of negative emotion, be detrimental to a child. Okay, question number 2. Is there an association between the first generation 1 and generation 2, their relationships? So now we're not just talking about the development of the child. By the way, if you're really interested in the effects of divorce and conflict on children, you should read work by a guy named Mark Cummings, who's at University of Notre Dame. Like, if that's what you want to write a paper about, for example, check out Mark Cummings' work. Really, really fine work. So is there an association between generation 1, our parents, and then the relationships that you and I form in adulthood? Okay? The answer is yes. Generation 1 divorce increases the risk of generation 2 divorce by about 70% in the first 5 years of marriage. People whose parents divorced are at an increased risk for getting divorced themselves. People whose parents were unhappy are at an increased risk of being unhappy themselves. And we also know that divorce tends to be more detrimental on generation 2 when it happens earlier and when it is abrupt and unexpected. Okay? Sometimes divorce is abrupt and unexpected. Paul Amato, Penn State University, very distinguished sociologist, was telling me about this one study that really surprised him, data that he had collected, in which he actually found instances of people who, the child would come home from at the end of the school day, and the mother would say, your father has moved out. That's it. That marriage is over. That's a pretty stunning sort of realization for a 5, 6, 7-year-old child to have. Because the world that you thought you were living in, all of a sudden you can't trust to anywhere near the degree you thought you could. Those feelings of distrust and uncertainty and hesitation carry through into adulthood. Now, does that always happen every time? No, this is the social sciences. We're not in chemistry, we're not in physics. These are probabilistic associations. People connect up with other people and they get reassured. People connect up with great partners and everything works out. But probabilistically, there is an increased risk. Is it a death sentence? Does it mean that if your parents got divorced or your parents had a lousy marriage, you're destined for a lousy marriage? Absolutely not. But it does increase the risk, and the risk is something we need to know about. Question in the back there. Shout it out. I can't quite hear you. I heard you say desensitized, though. Oh, I see your point, which is that, divorce is an acceptable thing. I'll do it myself. It's a great point. It's a superb point. In fact, we know from Paul Amato's other work that, second point, individuals who have a history of divorce in their family experience more caution toward marriage. So they're a little more cautious about getting into a marriage, and they're more accepting of divorce. There was one study that was done, one of my favorite studies. It showed that if you have two groups of unhappy people, right? Two groups of people who are unhappy in their relationship, equally unhappy. And you ask them, and one of which had divorced parents, and one of which had intact parents. If you ask them, what's the likelihood that you yourself would get divorced? Right? They've got equal levels of misery in their current marriage. The people with a history of divorce said, I'm a little, I'm seriously thinking about it. The people in intact marriages were not nearly as seriously thinking about divorce. So there is a greater acceptance, like this becomes a solution to the problem, right? This could work. So it's exactly the point that you're making about being slightly desensitized to divorce as an option. But what are some of the other reasons why there is this intergenerational transmission effect? Again, let me emphasize that it's not 100% predictive. It's not even close. It's an elevated risk, okay? And it's a risk we all want to know about. Just like if you had a genetic risk for diabetes, you'd want to know about it. If your parents have a troubled relationship, that was the model that you were exposed to, and you might need a little help figuring out what better models would be. To the extent that you're invested in figuring out what better models might be, and you have a good partner to help you deal with that, the risks can be eliminated. So, but to the extent that there is an association, why might that be? We talked about one reason. Another reason is that these people make a faster transition into adulthood, right? They usually leave home earlier. The home environment is not quite as pleasant. They also have less parental monitoring, right? Their parents just aren't around to keep an eye on them as much. They have fewer economic and interpersonal resources. Individuals whose parents divorced tend to get less education than people who grow up in intact families. They also, even later in life, end up having weaker family relationships because, after all, they may not have a relationship with their father, right? That's a lost resource to them. And again, unless some effort is made to restore that connection. They also display, when you put them in a laboratory context, they display more negative behaviors and they report more negative cognitions. And here's two studies, one by Matt Sanders, one by Lisa Story. And the idea is that you can videotape people talking about relationship issues, talking about relationship difficulties. You can evaluate the quality of that communication. And these studies show that individuals who have a history of parental divorce and high levels of conflict in the family are observed being more negative, more critical in their conversations. They are also, at least with just these two studies, they're not huge studies, but they point also to the higher levels of physical aggression and verbal aggression in relationships for individuals who have a history of parental divorce. Okay? And that seems to be, so the sequence of events seems to be you grow up exposed to models where negative emotion is not well regulated. You yourself enter relationships in which that becomes necessary but difficult. And to the extent that you don't engage in that good regulation of communication and negative emotion, overall, over time, that you will pay a price for that in your relationship. Again, is this 100% predictive? Absolutely not. But there are reliable statistical tendencies for this to be true. Okay, let me see what time we have. It is 4:09. I've got about 5 minutes. Let me try to give you a quick run through on attachment theory. And whatever I'm not able to get through today, I will cover when I come in and talk on Friday. Attachment theory, Professor Carney has already given you a brief introduction, and now in the theoretical chapter, you should have read a little bit about attachment theory. Attachment theory is very, very powerful and very valuable when it comes to the study of intimacy and intimate relationships. It developed, as many of you will know, if you took a class in child development, it really developed in the context of child development, and only recently, in fact, 1987, was this really extended to relationships in adulthood. Attachment theory is important when we think about relationships in adulthood because it answers two really good questions for us. One of them is, why does anyone form a close relationship? What's that about? What do we get out of that? And we think of this as sort of a nomothetic model or a universal model of attachment, right? Why does anybody have relationships and what sort of functions do they serve for us? Important question, and this theory, this perspective, gives us a nice answer to that question. The second question that this theory answers for us is, why are there differences amongst all of us in how we approach relationships? Why are there individual differences? So that is to say, how does one's attachment history affect the quality and duration of a given romantic relationship? Not just relationships in general, but the one you're in now. Okay? You see how those are different? That we think of as idiographic. So unique to you and unique to your own experiences, unique to the caregiving bonds that you were exposed to. So an attachment theorist says, how do people differ? Well, we've heard the trait perspective. We've heard a dynamics perspective. We heard the intergenerational, really sociological perspective. And now we're hearing the attachment perspective. The reason why individuals differ and the differences that matter in predicting something about your relationship have to do with the management of the caregiving bond that you were exposed to. So, what is attachment? Attachment is an intimate emotional bond in childhood now that one individual forms with another individual. We call that person the attachment figure, who can provide protection, comfort, and support. And that individual provides for us a secure base, a place that we can operate from when you're a child, and also a place to return to when you've been threatened as you go out into the world. As you probably know, attachment theory is associated with John Bowlby, a British psychoanalyst. And he was influenced in part by an ethologist, Konrad Lorenz, who studied imprinting. And Konrad Lorenz, you've probably seen this picture there on the upper right. He discovered that if you were the first person that baby geese saw, that the baby geese would follow you instead of their mother. Right? Baby geese imprint on something because they have a program within them that says you need to latch on something for comfort and support and survival. Okay? He won a Nobel Prize, Konrad Lorenz did. And so the idea that Bowlby picked up on was to say, well, it's got to be the same way among children, right? We have to attach to a human being, an adult human being, who can take care of us and provide us with that protection, that comfort and support that we need, and a secure base when we want to check out the world, and a place to come back to when the world is scary. Okay? So these bonds persist into adulthood, and so Bowlby in 1969 wrote, "A child's first relationship is the foundation stone of his personality." So remember, I said that what we're trying to do is draw links between experiences in a relationship and how that affects the individual. And now Bowlby is giving us the answer to that question. Let me just take you through one more slide, and then we'll pick up here tomorrow, on Friday. Now here's the universal system part, right? That is Mary Ainsworth, and she did a lot of the research that expanded on Bowlby's ideas. And she said, we have something within us called an attachment behavioral system. So she gave this label to the system that existed that Lorenz had identified. And this orients the infant to the caregiver and helps to ensure that the infant's survival. And this is the system that allows the infant to check out three things. Their internal state. How am I feeling? Am I scared? Am I upset? Am I comfortable? Do I need something? Or am I okay? The availability and responsiveness of the caregiver. So is there someone around? Right? Kids monitor. Kids look in their environment for help and support, even when they're just doing stuff. Right? When they're just doing stuff, kids are looking around. Kids are checking out who's available as support and nurturing and comfort should problems arise. And that's the third thing that we as infants monitor. Are there threats? Right? Is something bad going to happen? And if so, how do I feel about that? I need to register that inside of me, and I need to know where to go should a problem arise. This is the program that we have inherited. The infant experiences felt security, which, when they are threatened, results in efforts to restore proximity to the caregiver. So if you're out exploring the world and something bad happens to you, you rush back to your caregiver, and if that's possible, if there is a caregiver, you are vigilant to threats and to caregiver availability, right? So you're sort of checking it out. But if there is no caregiver, you sort of close down. You shut down emotionally, and you try to become invisible so that threat cannot attack, okay? Now, last thought. How that caregiver responds is crucial for the internal working models, for how you then organize yourself emotionally, and for how you think about yourself as a worthwhile human being, someone who's worthy of the attention and care, And the other part of that program that we carry around with us is to what extent, not just am I available and good, but to what extent are other people reliable and trustworthy? That becomes the foundation for the individual difference perspective, and I'll wrap up with that on Friday. So see you then.